The sky wept gray tears that morning, its heavy clouds hanging low as if mourning alongside the solemn gathering at Hannah's funeral. A profound silence cloaked the mourners, each one lost in private grief. Some clutched delicate handkerchiefs to their faces, others simply let the tears fall freely, their eyes reflecting the weight of cherished memories shared with Hannah. A soft breeze stirred the trees, their leaves whispering like gentle voices paying tribute to a life now gone. Then, without warning, a sharp sound shattered the fragile stillness. It was Duke, Hannah's loyal and beloved dog. His bark cut through the air, raw and urgent. He was no ordinary pet. To those who knew Hannah, Duke had been her shadow, her protector, a silent confidant who had shared every chapter of her life. Now standing rigid before the casket, his barking grew more frantic, his body trembling with something more than sorrow. His gaze, intense and unblinking, was locked into the simple wooden casket. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Murmured questions floated through the heavy air. What does he see? Some people shifted anxiously, casting nervous glances toward the dog and then to one another. Duke's urgency was unmistakable. His behavior was not mere grief, it was a desperate warning. His reputation in the village was well known. Duke was more than smart. Some whispered he had a sixth sense, an ability to perceive things far beyond human comprehension. Children instinctively pressed closer to their parents, the hair on their arms standing on end. Old legends of dogs sensing spirits or unseen dangers whispered back to them from their childhoods. What was Duke trying to tell them? The adults exchanged fearful glances, but remained frozen, too afraid to voice their growing dread. Despite efforts to calm him, Duke refused to be silenced. His entire being was focused, immovable, toward the casket. There was an unsettling certainty in his stance, a sense that something inside demanded to be revealed. Father Michael, who had been standing near the casket, shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. He adjusted his stole and cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the moment. His voice, when it came, was strained with false reassurance. He urged the congregation to remain calm, but the persistent, almost frantic barking tore apart any illusion of peace. With a forced smile that barely masked his growing panic, Father Michael stepped toward Duke, speaking to him in a low, coaxing tone. "Easy now, Duke. Everything is fine. Nothing to worry about here." His hand reached out in a shaky attempt to soothe the dog, but Duke recoiled, a deep growl rumbling from his chest, his eyes never leaving the casket. A bead of sweat traced its way down the priest's temple. He dabbed it away hurriedly, his hands trembling. Though he laughed nervously and insisted to the gathered mourners that it was simply the dog's grief, his eyes darted around the room with a hunted look. Even without words, his body betrayed him. Father Michael was afraid, deeply afraid. A hushed whisper carried through the crowd as an elderly woman leaned close to her neighbor. "He knows something," she murmured, her voice trembling. Around them, others began to sense the invisible shift in the air, a growing awareness that something was terribly wrong. Children gripped their parents' hands tighter, while the adults, seasoned by life's harder truths, exchanged grim looks. It was not only the dog who was stirring fear now, it was the priest's unease, as clear and loud as any alarm. Raising his voice, Father Michael ordered someone to take Duke outside, but the dog refused to move. His barking ceased for a brief second, only to resume with renewed urgency, as if pleading with them all not to turn away, not to ignore the warning blazing in his every movement. And then, amidst the chaos and confusion, a man stepped forward, a man most of them barely knew. His name was David, a recent arrival to the village. He was still a stranger to many, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet gravity, an intensity behind his eyes that set him apart. Though he had never known Hannah well, he had admired her from afar, drawn by her kindness and warmth. David's heart raced, but outwardly he remained calm. Mysteries had always called to him, pulled him toward the unseen threads others were too frightened to touch. Now seeing Duke's desperate attempt to communicate, David knew he could not stand idle. He approached slowly, his coat brushing the pews as he moved. The mourners watched with bated breath, some shaking their heads, others leaning forward, unable to look away. Kneeling beside Duke, David spoke in a voice so low and gentle it barely reached beyond the two of them. "What are you trying to tell us, friend?" he whispered. Duke's barking faltered. He looked into David's eyes, his own gleaming with a strange mix of fear, sadness, and something else. Hope. David held his gaze, feeling the dog's silent plea in his very soul. Turning his head, David followed Duke's line of sight directly to the casket. A sudden, icy chill crawled down his spine, a warning he felt in his bones. Something was wrong, terribly, hideously wrong. One of the men in the back called out, "Leave the dog alone!" But David only shook his head slowly, his voice carrying a firm conviction. "I believe he is trying to protect us," David said, "and maybe we should listen." Without waiting for permission, David leaned closer to Duke and encouraged him softly, "Go ahead, boy. Show me." Duke gave a small, understanding wag of his tail, then turned his nose to the ground. He moved forward cautiously, every step deliberate, his body tense but determined. His path led straight to the casket. The whispers swelled among the congregation like the rising wind before a storm. People began recalling old stories, the kind told in hushed tones around fires, of animals who could sense death, danger, or worse. Some clutched at the crosses around their necks. Others simply stared, too afraid to move. David, sensing the growing hysteria, remained focused on Duke. He felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him, the oppressive atmosphere thickening by the second. Father Michael's face had gone pale, his lips tightening into a thin, bloodless line. It was clear now. He no longer controlled the room, and the secret he was trying so hard to bury was straining against the casket's polished wood. The tension grew unbearable as David and Duke edged closer, closer still to whatever truth lay hidden. And the question that no one dared speak aloud screamed silently in every mind. What terrible secret had been buried along with Hannah? The letter was brief but powerful, its words trembling with urgency and fear. "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. Trust no one, especially not Father Michael. He knows everything." David stared at the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it. The room seemed to close in around him, the silence growing heavier, almost suffocating. Duke whined softly at his side, as if sensing the storm of emotions inside David. Father Michael. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell. What had Hannah discovered that had sealed her fate? He placed the letter carefully into his coat pocket, his mind racing. Everything suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. The priest's fear, his desperate attempts to silence David, the dog's refusal to leave the casket. Hannah hadn't died peacefully. She had been silenced. Driven by a renewed sense of urgency, David searched the rest of the house. But the deeper he looked, the more the house seemed to whisper fragments of a hidden story. A life lived in quiet fear, a woman who had dared to uncover something she should not have. As David stepped back outside, the wind picked up again, colder now, sharper, as if warning him of the danger ahead. Duke barked once, a short, decisive sound, before trotting off toward the woods behind Hannah's house, his nose low to the ground. Without hesitation, David followed. They wound their way through a narrow path overgrown with thorns and twisted branches, the trees closing in on them like silent sentinels. The light grew dimmer the further they went until they reached a clearing, and there, half buried under the roots of an old oak tree, Duke began to dig frantically. David knelt beside him, brushing away the dirt with his hands until something hard scraped against his fingers. It was another box, a metal one, rusted with age, its lock broken. Inside were more papers, but these were different. Parish records, financial ledgers, and photographs. Photographs of Father Michael meeting with men David didn't recognize. Men who looked dangerous, their faces hard and cold, even in still images. One photograph made David's blood run cold. It showed Hannah standing in front of the church, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists, with Father Michael standing behind her. His hand gripping her shoulder too tightly, his face twisted into a grimace that could never be mistaken for kindness. There was no doubt anymore. Hannah had discovered something terrible, something tied to Father Michael, and it had cost her life. Duke growled lowly, his body tense as if sensing something or someone approaching. David quickly gathered the papers and stood, his heart pounding. He was not just fighting for Hannah's truth anymore. He was fighting to survive. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell began to toll, not for a ceremony, not for mourning, but as a warning. David knew he had to move fast. The real battle for justice had just begun. He inhaled deeply, adjusting his cassock with trembling hands, and slowly swept his eyes across the room, as though trying to regain control over a moment quickly unraveling. With heavy, deliberate steps, Father Michael moved to the center of the church. Raising his arms, he called out, "Please, everyone, remain calm." His voice strained for authority, yet beneath the surface was a distinct tremor that betrayed his unease. "We are gathered here today to honor Hannah," he continued, the corners of his lips twitching in a forced expression of solemnity. "She was dearly loved by all of us, and this moment deserves peace, not disruption." But his gaze drifted, sharp and uneasy, locking directly onto David, still crouched beside the dog. Duke, who had not taken his eyes off the casket. There was something in the way the priest spoke, too controlled, too eager to shut things down, that only deepened the suspicion in the room. "It is not appropriate." Father Michael's voice suddenly sharpened, louder now, cutting through the murmuring crowd. "For someone to arrive here and stir confusion during such a sacred time." A few nods of agreement came from the pews, but others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Why did the priest seem so unnerved? Why was he so determined to silence the moment? Then, as though shedding his composure entirely, Father Michael pointed at David, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "What you're doing is disrespectful to Hannah's memory," he said harshly. "Step away from that dog and stop this nonsense." David didn't move. He held his ground, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing against him. But it was Father Michael's urgency, his desperation to end this, that screamed louder than any accusation. Something was off, deeply off. Beside him, Duke let out a low, guttural growl, not of aggression, but of unease, like he too felt the rising tension in the air. The sound made several people flinch. The priest's voice softened, but it trembled. "Please, let us not tarnish Hannah's farewell with this chaos. Let us pray for her peace, for ours." Yet for many, the peace he spoke of felt impossibly far. Though his words attempted to guide the room back to stillness, the sweat on his brow and the slight quiver in his clasped hands whispered a different truth. The church fell into a heavy silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes before something breaks. Everyone watched David, waiting. And then David asked the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone needed to hear. With quiet conviction, his eyes fixed on the priest, he asked, "Father Michael, how exactly did Hannah die?" Gasps rippled through the congregation, like a wave crashing against the pews. People shifted, whispering among themselves. Children clung tighter to their parents. Adults exchanged looks filled with fear and disbelief. Father Michael's eyes widened, his breath catching for a split second before he answered. "What do you mean?" he said sharply, his voice now defensive. "She died peacefully. I found her in her bed." "She passed in her sleep," he added, repeating the line as if hoping that saying it again would somehow make it more convincing. But David wasn't backing down. He took a step closer, speaking clearly and without hesitation. "Why was she alone that night, Father? And why were you the one who found her?" A deep hush fell across the church once more. The murmurs returned, lower now, but more intense. Not just whispers of doubt, but of fear. Father Michael's face flushed, his jaw clenched tight, and then, as though struck by some unseen force, he slammed his foot down. The loud crack against the floor echoed through the building. "This is madness," he shouted. "You dare bring shame into this sacred place? During her funeral?" He pointed again, his hand shaking. "You and that dog, leave, now!" The command hung in the air like a final verdict, but beside David, Duke barked. One sharp, forceful sound, not of fear but of defiance. It was almost as if the dog was urging him, "Keep going, don't stop now." And David understood. He had struck a nerve. A hidden truth was trembling at the edge of revelation. Without a word, he placed his hand gently on Duke's collar, gave the priest one last look, calm, unwavering, full of quiet accusation, and turned toward the church doors. Behind him, the murmurs of the crowd swelled. Suspicion had been planted, and now it was beginning to grow. Outside, the air felt heavier, colder. The sky loomed gray and oppressive. David could feel the weight of every step, every glance from behind the church windows. But he wasn't leaving in retreat. He was stepping into something deeper, something much more dangerous. "Come on, boy," he murmured to Duke, who trotted beside him with a determined spark in his eyes. "I think we're just getting started." The letter trembled slightly in David's hands as he read its contents, feeling the full gravity of Hannah's revelation settle onto his shoulders. In careful, shaky handwriting, she had written about dark truths she had uncovered, truths that directly implicated Father Michael. She spoke of serious discoveries, of things so dangerous she had been too afraid to share them with anyone but in hidden notes like this. David looked over at Duke, who sat alert beside him, his ears perked and his body tense, as if the dog could sense that they were getting dangerously close to something monumental. There was a charged stillness in the room, a feeling that whatever secrets had been buried were about to claw their way to the surface. Driven by a surge of urgency, David resumed his search. His fingers brushed against the back of one of the framed photographs hanging crookedly on the wall. Taped behind it, almost invisibly, was a small, rusty key. His breath caught. "What do you open?" he whispered, more to himself than to Duke. Duke gave a short, sharp bark, startling David, but it felt more like encouragement than warning, as if the dog was telling him, "Don't stop now. You're close." Next to where the key had been hidden, David noticed the photograph itself. He carefully peeled it from the wall and studied it. Hannah stood smiling stiffly next to Father Michael, the church's grand facade stretching behind them. But David's eyes quickly caught on something else, a detail most would have overlooked. At the bottom edge of the photograph, almost hidden in the grass, was a small dented metal box. The exact kind Hannah had described in her letters. The box where she claimed the priest stashed stolen money. David's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed that he was on the right path. "We're on the right track, Duke," he murmured, reaching down to pet the dog's head. Duke leaned into his touch, tail wagging once with restrained excitement. If Hannah was trying to tell us something, maybe this key is the piece we've been missing. Determination flooded David's chest, steadying his nerves. With the key clutched tightly in his hand and Duke steadfast at his side, he knew they were closer than ever to unraveling the truth. But finding out what the priest was hiding would mean more than just searching Hannah's house. It meant scouring every corner of the village, and David would not rest until he had answers. The village looked peaceful under the soft afternoon sun, but David knew better now. He could feel it, a heavy darkness hiding beneath the surface, cloaked by polite smiles and ancient stone walls. He decided their next stop would be the town library, a dusty ancient place that smelled of old paper and secrets. Maybe there, hidden among forgotten records, he would find the missing pieces. The library was nearly deserted when David and Duke entered. The librarian, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, barely glanced up from her desk. David slipped between the towering shelves, his fingertips grazing the spines of crumbling books and worn photo albums. Time seemed to blur as he searched. Finally, tucked between local history volumes, he found a brittle old photo album labeled Brinkhaven Community Events. Flipping through its pages, David saw photographs of festivals, church ceremonies, school plays, images frozen in time. And then, there it was, a series of photographs of Hannah. One particular image made David's breath catch. In it, Hannah stood again beside Father Michael, but this time her expression was unmistakable. Not joy, not pride. It was fear, deep, gnawing fear masked behind a brittle smile. Her hands were clenched so tightly they looked painful. David leaned closer, studying every detail. And then he saw it again, just barely visible on the edge of the frame. That same small metal box. His stomach churned. Whatever Hannah had discovered had terrified her, and she had carried that knowledge in secret, alone. Driven by a deep, burning need for truth, David rushed back to Hannah's house, Duke faithfully trotting alongside him. Inside, the house seemed even emptier now, almost hollow. Dust motes floated lazily in shafts of light. Yet David could feel Hannah's presence everywhere, whispering, guiding him. He continued searching, throwing back curtains, opening drawers, tapping along the walls. Finally, behind a heavy old curtain near the living room, he found it, a hidden cabinet recessed into the wall. Inside was a notebook, worn and battered, Hannah's diary. David pulled it out with reverent hands, feeling the weight of it before he even opened the cover. Duke sat by his feet, tense and alert. Flipping through the pages, David's heart began to hammer in his chest. The diary was filled with frantic, urgent notes, observations, warnings, and then in Hannah's neat handwriting he found it. He's stealing from everyone. Father Michael is using the congregation's trust to cover up his crimes. I have proof. I must be careful now. I think he suspects me. David's throat tightened. Each word seared into him like a brand. Tucked among the pages was an envelope stuffed with more photographs. Secret shots of Father Michael in hidden corners of the church, always near that same small metal box. In one, he stood beside an ancient statue, positioning the box carefully, almost reverently, as if hiding something underneath. David shivered. It wasn't just theft. It was something deeper, darker. She knew everything, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of it. He knelt beside Duke, who whined softly, sensing the rising tension. We have to find that box, David said, his voice low and steady. Everything she uncovered, it's all tied to it. Gripping the diary tightly, David set out toward the church once more, each step filled with a burning sense of purpose. The village streets were deserted as David and Duke made their way toward the looming figure of the church. The sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken threat. The church doors were ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. David hesitated only a moment before pushing them open and slipping inside. Inside, the church was shrouded in shadows. Every stained glass window seemed darker than it should have been. Silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the soft pad of Duke's paws against the stone floor. David moved carefully, his memory guiding him. He approached the corner of the church where the statue stood, the same one from the photograph. The stone figure seemed to loom over him, its expression severe, almost judging. David knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he felt along the statue's base. Dust and grime coated his fingers. And then he found it, a loose panel. Peeling it back carefully, he revealed a hidden compartment. There, cradled in the darkness, was the small metal box. David pulled it free, his heart pounding, and exchanged a wide-eyed look with Duke, who wagged his tail in silent encouragement. The box was cold and heavy in his hands. Its lock clicked softly as he used the key he had found at Hannah's house. The lid creaked open. Inside, bundles of cash were packed tightly together, each one marked with handwritten labels. Donations, tithes, fundraisers. But that was not all. Beneath the stacks of money, David found a small, ornate key. He turned it over in his hand, studying its intricate design. A key, he murmured. But to what? Just as he lifted it from the box, a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped out from underneath the money. David caught it gently before it could drift to the ground. Unfolding it slowly, he began to read. And as the words formed before his eyes, the blood drained from his face. The letter revealed something chilling. Hannah had uncovered dark, serious secrets about Father Michael. David exchanged a tense glance with Duke, who stood alert, as if sensing they were on the brink of something critical. Continuing his search, David's fingers brushed against something behind one of the framed pictures. He pulled it away from the wall and found a small key taped carefully to the back. "What does this open?" he murmured, feeling a rush of adrenaline. Duke let out a short, urgent bark, his tail wagging stiffly, encouraging David to keep digging. Next to the key, David noticed an old photograph. In it, Hannah stood beside Father Michael, the church looming behind them. But it wasn't their faces that caught David's attention. It was a detail near the bottom of the image, a small metal box tucked into the corner of the frame, identical to the one Hannah had described in her letters. The one hiding stolen money. "We're on the right track, Duke," David said, patting the dog's head. "If Hannah wanted us to find something, maybe this key is the answer." Determination surged through him. With the small key gripped tightly in his hand and Duke steadfast at his side, David felt closer than ever to uncovering the truth. He knew the time had come to search every corner of the village. And you, what would you have done if you were in David's place? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned. The ending will be unforgettable. With the key secured, David headed to the heart of the village, the place where everything seemed deceptively peaceful. But David knew better. Something sinister lurked beneath the quiet. Driven by the weight of Hannah's warnings, he made his way to the town library. Dusty shelves and the smell of aged paper filled the air as he scoured through ancient documents and faded photographs. After hours of searching, David found what he needed: an old photo album chronicling the village's history. Flipping through the worn pages, David's breath caught. There was Hannah again, standing beside Father Michael. But this time her face told a different story. Not joy or pride, but deep unease. Fear almost radiated from the photograph. "What did you find, Hannah?" he whispered. Then he saw it again, barely visible in the corner of the frame. The same metal box. Fueled by a fresh surge of urgency, David rushed back to Hannah's house. He tore through the rooms, searching for anything she might have hidden. Behind an old curtain, he found a concealed cabinet. Inside was something priceless: Hannah's diary. The pages trembled in his hands as he read. Line by line, a dark conspiracy unfolded. Hannah had discovered a network of corruption inside the church itself. Father Michael, the man everyone trusted, was embezzling money, using people's faith to hide his crimes and amass a fortune for sinister purposes. David's chest tightened as he read Hannah's words. He's stealing from everyone, using their trust to shield his lies. Among the diary pages, David found an envelope crammed with photographs. There was Father Michael again, sneaking through secret parts of the church, carrying the same metal box. In one chilling photo, he stood beside an old statue, the box hidden carefully beneath it. David shuddered. She found everything, and that's why she was in danger. Gripping the diary and the tiny key, David knew what he had to do. "We have a big secret to uncover, boy," he whispered to Duke, who wagged his tail as if ready for battle. Every step back to the church felt heavier. The village streets were silent under the fading sun, the air thick with something unseen yet deeply felt. Reaching the church, David made sure no one was watching. The door creaked open, revealing a sanctuary cloaked in shadows. He moved carefully, guided by the memory of Hannah's photographs. There it was, the statue tucked away in the corner, gazing down with a solemn, judging stare. Kneeling, David ran his hands along the statue's base and found it, hidden under a scrap of fabric, the metal box. Heart pounding, he opened it. Bundles of money tumbled out, labeled with names of villagers who had trusted their donations to the church. And beneath the money, a key and a folded, yellowed map. Unfolding the map, David saw it immediately, a red circle marking a location within the church, labeled Church Storage. "This is it, Duke," he whispered. "This is where Hannah found the truth." Gripping the key like a lifeline, David and Duke searched the church until they found it. A hidden door behind the altar, a place few even knew existed. The key slid into the lock. With a groan, the door swung open, revealing a steep staircase disappearing into darkness. Flashlight trembling, David descended. The basement smelled of damp stone and old secrets. At the end of a shadowy corridor, a single light bulb flickered, illuminating the heartbreaking sight. There, chained to a chair, pale and trembling, was Hannah. "Hannah!" David cried, rushing forward. Her voice, weak but filled with gratitude, answered, "David, you found me." But before he could reach her, a figure emerged from the shadows. Father Michael. Fury twisted his features as he raised a wooden plank. "You should have left it alone," he roared. The plank swung toward David. He dodged, barely missing a blow that would have shattered him. Staggering backward, he raised his arms defensively, stunned by the ferocity of a man who had once preached peace. The priest lifted the plank for a final strike, but Duke, faithful and fearless, sprang forward, clamping his jaws into Father Michael's leg. The priest howled in agony, dropping the weapon. David scrambled to his feet, his heart thundering, and chased after him as Father Michael fled the basement. Out in the village streets, the commotion had already drawn a crowd. Residents gasped as they saw the once respected priest in a desperate struggle with David and Duke. "Stop!" David shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "You all need to know the truth." While Duke pinned the priest, David unveiled everything: the stolen donations, the secret storage, Hannah's kidnapping. Murmurs of shock and betrayal rippled through the crowd. Father Michael, seeing the tide turn against him, made one last desperate attempt to flee, but Duke, relentless, brought him down in the village square. The villagers, filled with outrage and disbelief, rushed to restrain him, Breathless, David led everyone back to the church. He opened the metal box, revealing the damning evidence. The villagers stared in horror at the bundles of stolen money. Finally, David led them down to the basement. Tears welled in many eyes as they saw Hannah, alive and trembling, but free at last. Duke bounded to her side, tail wagging madly as if celebrating their triumph. Exposed and humiliated, Father Michael tried to speak, but his words fell on deaf ears. No one wanted to hear his lies anymore. His crimes were undeniable, visible to all. The police arrived and led the disgraced priest away in handcuffs. The village, still reeling, vowed to rebuild, this time on foundations of truth, not blind trust. David stayed, helping Hannah heal and becoming part of a community that had found new strength in honesty. His bravery and Duke's unbreakable loyalty became legends whispered through the village streets. Children laughed and played around Duke, the local hero, while villagers greeted David with warmth and gratitude. The darkness had been exposed, the lies shattered, and from the ruins, something new and beautiful was born. A village built not on appearances, but on truth and courage. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed David and Duke's incredible bravery, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means everything to us. Wolf Sparkle.